Thank you very much, everybody, and welcome. We're going to do something slightly different right now. Those of you who've seen me before will know that normally when I stand up, I try and tell a bad joke, and I probably show some video. And this is a totally different kind of presentation from me. It actually has some factual content, which in amongst pictures of penguins falling into ice water may come as something of a contrast. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of my experiences and a bit of my comments about whether or not the best places in the world to start businesses are actually the ones where most people think they are. And I'm drawing on my experience as the director of UCL's Center for Entrepreneurship, which is called UCL Advances, and as UCL's director of enterprise operations, which is the bit that deals with big companies within the university. I'm not an academic. I'm somebody who's been out and worked in startups for most of my working life. I've been a VC and I've been involved in starting about 25 companies of various different sorts. And these are my observations backed up with the information that I could find. So to start with, for the purposes of today's talk, just a quick question, and there'll be quite a lot of me asking questions at the moment. Who here thinks that they could identify the best place in the world to start a business? Oh, come on, don't all go at once. It's going to be a long session if nobody's going to answer any questions at any point. Come on, somebody give me an idea. Yes? You think London's a good place? Would that possibly be because of the title of my presentation and where we are being slightly different? Okay, London is a great place. Anybody else? University. A university. I was thinking more of a geographic location than necessarily a place, but universities are good. Yep. China. Interesting. These aren't the places. Yep. Southeast Asia. Why Southeast Asia? Okay, Africa, similar reason. Why China? Similar, okay, because it's got lots of possibilities. Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is the traditional answer. It used to be that everybody would say that Silicon Valley or other parts of the US more generally was the best place to start a business because of the combination, the legal structures and the investment structures and so on. And indeed, that's really still been the predominant way that people have thought about starting businesses for years. Now, what I'm going to argue in the next 10 minutes or so is that all is not better in America. That there's this thing called the hype curve in America, or I'm calling the hype curve, which many of you may have experienced in various different forms. Is anybody here American, by the way? Okay. Only 4, that's good. Just making sure, and none of them conveniently are that close to me either. They're all further back. So we're going to talk about this and why that's not actually necessarily a bad thing, and why America isn't necessarily doing anything wrong. It's just that there is a massive gap between perception and reality. So to start with, the common view is, and has been for years, that the US is the best place to start a business. Now here I'm talking about particularly, as an example, particularly tech-focused businesses, and particularly those that need investment, of a sort of venture capital type investment. The sort of traditional things that people think of when they think about startups and the need to raise money and so on. It's a limited view, but it's one that conforms to what many people think about. And the reasons for that are actually pretty good. You know, if I asked you to name big technology companies in the world, you'd probably come up with some of the names that are on there, the Googles and the Apples and the eBays and Cisco and Intel. And they actually all really do come or work now in a really quite concentrated area in Northern California, the Silicon Valley. Similarly, the birth of the venture capital industry as it looks now, and possibly most famously on Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park in California. These bits are the sort of the traditional emblems of what it was to start a business and to make billions, whether or not you were trying to change the world or just produce more boring software. And it's mimicked by the fact that today, this is one of the most recent rankings that takes place of place to start businesses, you'll find that Silicon Valley still traditionally comes out top. Now, those kind of surveys can be done on a basis of economic indicators and of perception indexes and of surveys and so on. And Silicon Valley will still come out on top, and depending on which one you look at, you'll then either get some combination of New York and Boston and then Tel Aviv and so on. London does come out by and large as the best place in Europe, and the gap for that tends to be pretty large, but you've got a cluster of things at the top in the US. And on the basis of those kinds of surveys and those kinds of tables, people think quite often that the same historic differences that existed over the last after the last 40, 50, even 10 or so years are actually still true right now. And my point is basically, well, is it? So the US definitely got there first in trying to build a venture capital base and a community of startups and serial entrepreneurs who've now a generation or two gone on to found further companies. But is that still really the best? Well, interestingly, despite what you guys just decided to completely subvert me with doing by not mentioning the US as the first example of places to go, the truth is that the majority of people actually do still think that the US is the best place to go. And when you compare them, when you compare attitudes amongst entrepreneurs, this is data from a survey of entrepreneurs around the world called the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. They give an indication that entrepreneurs in the UK and entrepreneurs in the US do still have fairly different attitudes. And their attitudes of perception, their differences in perception. The idea, the perceived opportunity for you to be able to go out and start a business and deliver it is better in the US. The perceived capability and your ability to do it and the people that you need is better than the US. The fear of failure, well actually that's historically the thing that everybody has said, particularly in the UK and a European context, was the thing that was holding back the entrepreneurial generations. That actually the fear factor, the fear of failure, was so much greater. That is still better in the US, although not by anywhere near as much as it was a generation ago. Those that have the intention to go off and start businesses, also slightly higher in the US. But these are all questions of perception. They're not necessarily what happens if you choose to go and start it. Now, by and large, there's about, in most crude indicators, about twice the level of sort of investment activity, for example, or startup attempts that are made in the US compared to Europe. But it isn't necessarily the case that if you want to go and start a business, that these perceptions actually convert into success factors and whether or not you'll make it. The gap isn't as big as that data and perception suggests, not the reality, not the outturn data. And if you look at this, which is some information about what will happen if you went and actually sought a VC round, you'll see that the differences are so minuscule you can actually take account of them mostly through how you define the currency exchange rate or purchasing power parity and things like that. This is data basically says if you are trying to raise money at the seed stage, at the first stage when you go out and try and raise professional money, actually the figures are remarkably similar, not only for the UK, which is actually slightly higher than the rest of Europe, and probably almost exactly matches that of the US in these figures, but as Europe as a whole, that the mean amount of investment that is made is about the same. The mean valuation is about the same. The sort of implied percentage that you'd get in order to give it away is about the same. The amount of money that people think that their companies are worth, that they'll actually take an investment, and the deals that they would get are about the same. And that flies in the face of almost everybody who has ever attempted to go and get investment money, who supposedly will tell you that it's so much easier in the US. And the reality is it isn't. What's easier in the US is to get somebody who tells you that they're interested in making an investment, not necessarily that they will do it. And that's a point I'll come back to in a bit. If they make an investment, the deals don't look very different. So why is it that people still think that the US is a better place to do this? Well, the first thing is that this isn't a unique phenomenon. It's not just in investment terms and in startup terms that you see this idea of the US portraying itself as the best place in the world to do something. So another quick poll, and please try not to confuse things at this point for the benefit of the audience on the end of this camera. That was a joke, it's okay. Do you think, if you've lived here for the last at least couple of years, do you think that the UK has been through a double or a triple dip recession? I.e., we went through recession, came out of it, went back into recession, came out of it again, and possibly went out of recession and went back again. Anybody think that the UK has been through a double or triple dip recession in the last couple of years? Okay, it's a reasonable number of people. It's about a quarter of the room. Anybody think that we haven't been through recession at all? One and a half. 1.5. I suspect the half is suggesting that I'm going to say something clever. Well, we have been through a recession, but we haven't been through either a double or a triple dip. Now, you would have been forgiven for thinking that was going to happen, because the news headlines, in the way that we tend to do things in the UK, have basically underlined this point for months. Going back January and March, you'll have seen headlines on the BBC, on the news bulletins, in every major newspaper to say, do you know what, we're going to go through a triple dip recession in the UK. It's all doom and gloom and nothing's going to work. Nobody wants to buy anything, nobody's investing anything, it's all going to go wrong. In actual fact, the triple recession has taken place. But notice that all of these are predictions of headlines about what they expect is going to happen, that it is going to be announced that the UK is going into a triple-dip recession, or what have you, and not what actually happened. And part of what actually happened was a result of the way that the economic figures are produced. And this is an example of exactly the sort of phenomenon I'm talking about. So this is economic data compiled by Goldman Sachs. And what it basically talks about is that when an estimate is made of GDP, when you read the headlines that says, in the last quarter, the UK grew or shrank by a certain percentage, that's usually data that's actually only for a period of time that's just taken place. So by about April, we're already saying this is what happened up till the end of March. And these figures are really not that reliable. And the headlines of the sort that you've seen tend to be based on these figures. And what it basically will say is that most of the time, the economic figures that have taken place have seen the UK grow by 1% or shrink by 0.2% or what have you. But those figures are continually revised for years to come, not just for months, but for years to come. And in the UK, between 2001 and 2010, those first estimates of GDP, the things that you read in the newspaper headlines, the things that said the UK is going into a triple-dip recession or a double-dip recession and so on, averaged over 10 years the idea that we would have been growing at about 1.3%. Once we'd actually stopped and thought about it for a bit and revised the figures and know what actually happened, as I say, usually months later, turns out we grew a lot faster than we thought we had. This was the newspaper headlines. This is what happened. This is what most of you base your perceptions on. This is what actually was the outturn. And it turns out that the UK consistently, in its nice and very genteel way, likes to underestimate things. We just want to play it a little bit safe. We'll tell you we grew by this much. It might have been a bit bigger, but we'll give you the downside just in case you're planning a holiday. And in actual fact, on average, we grew quite a lot. Now, Euroland figures, they're not so bad. They're pretty accurate. They've come out with their first estimates, and the latest is pretty similar, and the outcome isn't that different. The Americans, on the other hand, well, I'm afraid they rather overstate things. It's rather based on the PR and the fluff and the hype. They'll tell you that overall, in the newspaper headline version, that they were growing by about 2.1%, and yet it turns out for a decade, they've been growing less quickly than the UK. Anybody here surprised by that? The US has grown less for the last decade than the UK has. And part of the reason for that is that this is the figure that everybody takes on board. This is the figure that people build on planning. But most of the time, when they revise it, the US hasn't grown anywhere near as much as it thinks it did, as a way that when it first presented the figures. We underestimate it, full of pessimism. Americans, full of nice, young, aggressive, youthful optimism. Sadly, it doesn't quite match. And so Americans are simply better at hype. And they're not just better at saying good things. The UK is particularly bad at saying, being pessimistic. And this is a fairly traditional view, but you need to understand that these cultural differences matter. It's not just that it's a moderately, less interesting place to be if you basically want to go, ooh, rah, 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 razzmatazz, and, lots of fireworks and cheerleaders and so on. We don't do any of those kind of things. That's not really our style. But if you're trying to make decisions, like where should you base a company, where should you take investment and so on, and these are the sort of situations you're looking at, you need to understand that actually the world is very different sometimes from the way it's perceived. Scandinavia and Asia have similar problems. One of the things that you can see again and again, anybody here from Scandinavia? See, that actually, even if there is anybody from Scandinavia, they probably wouldn't put their hand up. Scandinavians don't necessarily like to stand out from the crowd. It's about uniformity, it's about conformity, it's about quite often people who are successes in Scandinavia don't really, can be criticized for standing out, for saying that, why do you think you're better than somebody else? In China particularly, but a more wider Asian phenomenon, is the difficulties in talking about things that aren't working. So these different types of cultural feelings about people saying, this is what we do, this is what we're good at, this is what we're not good at, this is how well we've done, they apply around the world. And the important point is that you can understand them, and that as individuals, wherever you're going to work, wherever it is you're going to start a company, in my example, but more generally as well, you're able to understand and interpret those cultural differences. So how big is the gap really? If I'm making the case that the UK is actually doing a lot better than it thinks it is, let alone anybody else, what does the gap really look like? Well, very quickly. Actually, The gap between even Silicon Valley is the best place in the US, let alone the US as a whole, to start a business compared to the UK, is actually pretty small. And in some places, the UK does really rather well and beats it. I'm not going to go through these in any kind of detail, but this is a comparison of the type of people that start businesses, of entrepreneurs, between London and Silicon Valley, the best in Europe and the best in the US. And actually, we're amazingly similar. Average age, the split between men and women, is still incredibly low in terms of the number of people who start women, but broadly similar in the two jurisdictions. We have, the level of education, not hugely different. Serial entrepreneurs, that is different. Right? There's fewer people who've been and gone and done it before in London, and that reflects that historic lead that the US has had. There's simply more people around who've been and started businesses and raised VC funding before, who are going on to do it again. But most of these figures are surprisingly similar. Indeed, they're similar enough that 25% of the people who are in London who start businesses were actually in Silicon Valley before, but came here because they now feel that this is a better place in which to do it. There aren't really very many motivations or differences at all. The types of markets, the type of customers that they go after, we're really remarkably similar. You look at a ranking table and you start to see 5 or 10 different places. Actually, the spread doesn't really give you any understanding of how small the gap really is. This is the number of deals that are done, VC deals that are done in the US and in Europe over time in year. Now this was appalling. We didn't really do this stuff in Europe. There weren't major VC deals, and what there were actually weren't very well recorded, so the data before about 1990 is particularly poor anyway. But actually, there's a reasonable track. There is a gap. The market is bigger in the US, but the tracking of it and how it responds to things and the number of people who are starting are more or less the same. This is a list of, depending on which year you took funding when you started up, is what's your percentage chance that you've already had an IPO, that you've already floated on the markets. And amazingly, and I have to say, these sets of figures surprised me completely, actually, is that you are, in most years, you're about as likely in each country to have ended up floating your company on the stock exchange, depending on when you started it, as in Europe or in the US. And in fact, in a majority of years, you're more likely to have floated if you were in Europe. So if you started your business in the last 15 years or so, generally, and first time you took funding was in the last decade, you're at least as likely to have now floated your company in Europe as you are in the US. Again, whatever the impression is that you get, you do just as well by being here as you would if you were in the US. So how might you experience this? Well, this is my take on trying to blend these ideas together. There was a question earlier that Ahmad asked, but I'm afraid I didn't see the answer. Who here is interested in starting a company or has started a company, has a small business? Okay, I'm going to guess that's a bit over half the room. Well, let me tell you, and I'm afraid I was a VC for a while, back in the dot-com days, which was where that massive peak was in the number of deals that were there. And I can tell you that I think this is true from my personal experience as well as from the work we do now working with startups across Europe. This is my way of describing the journey of going through a VC process. If you imagine a time scale, a journey in months, and hype, which I'm going to express by the amount of money they tell you your business is worth, then the experience that you probably would go through if you were in the US is something like this. Oh my God, that company's amazing, it's wonderful, it's the best thing I've ever seen. Oh wait, hold on, there might be an issue, yeah. And then they stop returning your calls. And in a small number of cases, you do well. Okay, you'll do well, and halfway through, they have a bit of a question, and actually, they go off and you'll get an investment deal. By comparison, the experience, particularly in the UK, is, really, is that the best you've got? I'm sorry, I've seen 15 of those this week. It's rubbish. I can't be bothered to talk to you anymore. So there you go. Oh, no, hold on. Wait, actually, it is quite interesting. Sorry, didn't return your calls. I'd quite like to do it. And it turns out that the figures are about the same. You'll get the deals in about the same percentage of cases. You'll get the deals in the same thing, but the experience is different. And I have lost students who are trying to start businesses. We've got something like 10 students who've left UCL in the last 18 months who've all managed to raise more than $2 million each within 18 months of leaving, all of them in the US. That happens. It's not a problem. But we've also got students who left here because they believed this, the false enthusiasm, when they sent their business plans off somewhere in the US and they spent 18 months couch surfing their way through the US and have started to come back with $40,000 or $50,000 worth of debt and no real idea where they're going next. Because that false enthusiasm is about being taken and told that you're the next best thing, you're wonderful, and being led all the way to the altar, and then unfortunately being left there. Whereas in the UK, you have an equal sense of undue pessimism. It's simply not going to work. It's simply rubbish. And it's a bit like trying to encourage somebody. I used to have a lecturer when I was a student here at UCL who said if anybody ever asked him if he should do a PhD, if they should do a PhD, he always said no. Because if him saying no put you off, then you weren't really going to get through your PhD anyway. You shouldn't even try it. So that sort of undue pessimism leads to a cultural gap. And what the point that I'm making is you need to understand that that gap is just that. It's just cultural. It isn't about the end result that you will go through if you try and start a business or if you try and raise money. And the lesson is a fairly straightforward and simple one. The hype curve leads to a false picture of reality. Do not be seduced by the hype curve. Look at where the best place might be for you and for your business and for the kind of thing that you want to do. So my conclusions are this. Look, it's simple. I'm not trying to overcomplicate this, but the business cultures are not necessarily based in fact. Have a look at what it is that's right for you and right for raising the kind of money. If you want to work in areas like finance, media, broadcasting, if you want to do apps, if you want to do things like that, you don't want to be certainly on the east coast of the US, New York and so on. London is the global center for many of those industries. This is where your customers are. You'd be based here. You can't do financial services things based in California. The US is overwhelmingly, which was historically the case in terms of places to raise money and how you would go about it, that has been true for decades, is no longer there. And you can see the time lag data, you can see all the stuff historically that didn't work, and now the fact that that has been replaced. And if you do have a good idea, you actually can now pretty well start it anywhere. There were some, talking about some of the previous speakers and their enjoyment of and prospects for India and China and a whole load of other markets. But these things can be there. The critical thing is that you look at the reality and not at the hype. And then at the end of the day, you actually go off and start a business. Thank you very much.